probably, I would like to explain the term emotional toxicity, because I am not sure that people will immediately know what I mean by this, right? I talk about emotional toxicity, but it's a very broad term. It's a very broad term. So basically, the reason why this is so important to address, first of all, is that, you know, Hashimoto's is an autoimmune condition, right? It is an autoimmune condition. We know that. So we have our immune system, a nervous system, and endocrine system, which is a hormonal system, connected. This is how, so I want to explain that this is important biologically. This is not just me kind of pulling this out of the sky, right?
Yeah,
this is
not
biology.
a woo thing, right? It's totally biochemistry and physics.
So when you think about those three systems feeding into each other, and obviously people may have heard of hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis. This is all sort of like revolving around that. And so you have those three systems feeding into each other. And then, of course, any stresses, and that's any stresses. So, of course, if you have a toxic diet, that's stress to the body, right? If we have chronic infections, that's stress to the body. If you have a physical trauma, like I broke my arm in 4 places a few months ago, that's the trauma to the body. But of course, so we have to recognize stress is not just emotional, right?
Yeah.
But there is this massive, ginormous part, which is the umbrella that is the emotional toxicity. But here is the thing, when people hear about chronic stress, you know, they know that it contributes to the problem, because most people these days, I mean, there's been so much research on it. Most people know chronic stress is connected to your illness if you have one. But when people think of chronic stress, they usually think that maybe they had money problems, or maybe they're running up and down, sorting their kids out, and it's like pressure and it's stressful, and they're thinking of that. But there's an awful lot more that we need to be thinking of when thinking about this emotional toxicity. So first of all, I already mentioned the early trauma. So when they did that original study, interestingly, the connection to autoimmune disorder, the correlation between having just 2 of those ACEs, so those adverse childhood events, to autoimmunity was like the correlation was 80%. So 70-80% of people who have who had at least 2 of those traumatic experiences they identified in the study turned out to have autoimmunity. And then chronic fatigue was something like 600% higher in those people who had just 2 of those adverse childhood experiences. I had something like 7. I mean, right? So we now starting to see how much of an impact that causes. And that correlation, that study was very good, but what it didn't do, it was like a preliminary thing that they came up with, which is very good, but they forgot to include an awful lot of traumatic stuff that people go through. So that didn't even include all the trauma. That just included some of the trauma. But then we have things such as developmental trauma. So this is interesting, because somebody could say to me, and often people come to me and say, well, actually, you know, I didn't have any traumas as a child, and my parents were happy. They didn't divorce. I wasn't abused. I wasn't bullied, all of that. Nobody died, right? Okay, fine. But parents were really busy, and they didn't give me lots of kisses and cuddles when I was little. Now, when you don't get from that point of conception, so that's 0 to 4 years old, when you don't get a lot of emotional nurturing, that can cause difficulties with bonding, and people will feel that I often work with people who didn't have a massive trauma, but what they have is they have this fear of abandonment, they have this fear of detachment. They feel like they never really bonded with their caregivers and therefore other people in their lives. So this is an interesting one, because it's not about what was happening. It was about what wasn't happening, which is really difficult to pinpoint, isn't it? Because, but so many times I have people with exactly that. They didn't have those massive traumas, but they didn't feel that the parents were emotionally giving them, the parents were great. They were putting food on the table, they were clothing them, they were giving them the stuff that they, physically needed, but they were perhaps too busy or too uncomfortable, because some people just don't like giving affection, do they? They're not very tactile. They're not into kisses and cuddles. A small child from 0 to 4 needs that just as much as they need food. Yeah. So we have this massive thing with developmental trauma. This is sometimes worse than a big trauma. And then on top of that, let's not forget that when we are born, we have certain personality traits. So some children will already be showing that really early in their lives. And if they are a certain way and then they're being pushed to being a different way, that can traumatize them. What can also traumatize people is just being socially, what I call social engineering, being labeled. You have to be this or you have to be that, because your parents believe that, you must, when you grow up, you must be a doctor and you must be super achiever and whatever. But if you want to be an artist and you don't want to do any of that stuff, and they push you to do it, do you see what I mean? Yeah. Because the society wants you to be successful or whatever, it will perceive you to be successful if you achieve X, Y, Z. If that doesn't agree with somebody and they go against themselves and they have this emotional conflict all their lives, that's a traumatic thing. So there's so many of those things. And basically, when people feel not good enough, when they feel like perhaps they always feel like they need to prove themselves, or they have fears like fear of rejection, fear of criticism, yes, fear of failure, right, or fear of losing control. So many people have that fear every single day. They live with that. That's basically messing with their health every day, because when you have those fears, when you have those conflicts, when you have those things like, in your head that you kind of want to behave one way, but you can't quite do it because your head tells you something else, that's an emotional conflict. You don't just go away and forget about it. It's with you all the time. And that's chronic stress. And chronic stress contributes to illness, right? So I hope I'm making sense here. This emotional toxicity stuff, it's massive. And there's this things like toxic relationships, right, as well. People get stuck in those because when you have early trauma and when you have this conditioning early in your life and you're being boxed in and you're being labeled, you develop your values and belief systems based on that. And you can go through life having certain belief of yourself that, for instance, that you're never going to amount to anything and you're not good enough. Now that's very damaging. And so it's a huge subject, right? But what I'm saying is, if anybody who feels anxious, who feels fearful, who feels not good enough, people who overanalyze, they always have to be busy because they can't just sit with their thoughts because that makes them uncomfortable. It's stuff like that there is some emotional toxicity there. So it doesn't have to be a big trauma is what I'm saying. That's really the bottom line.
Yeah.
And
so
I